I remember the exact taste of dust that day, the iron tang of it at the back of my throat, like a metal promise that would not wash away. I also remember the smell of Thomas's coat, tobacco and saddle soap, and the faint lemon scent he always used when he wanted me to know he'd been thinking of home. He had been thinking of home the last night he lived. He had been thinking of truth too, and for that he was killed. For that he was made an example. My name is Mara Ellis. At 42, I had learned how to stitch a wound and stitch a column. I trained as a nurse in Boston before the war, tended to men whose names would become headlines or disappear into them. Then I learned words could be medicine, too. I taught myself to write with the same steady hands I used to untangle knots of rope and tend broken men. I married Thomas because he could hum any song I could hum back at me, and because he believed in justice the way some believe in God. When the mine in Garrison Gulch began to swallow men whole, men like the ones Thomas worked beside, he started writing down names, dates, payments. He came to me with a ledger one night, a small book with rows of handwriting so cruelly neat it looked like it had been written by a machine. He said the names belonged to men who'd been paid to keep their mouths shut, to men who'd been paid to frighten the rest. The first blow was the one that kills you slowly, being told your life is a cautionary tale. The sheriff called Thomas's death an accident. The papers printed a flowery line about a tragedy at the mill. The mine owner, Bartholomew Gentry, gave condolences and money and smiles like flint. They tried to buy our grief into something acceptable. Then the whispers began. Thomas, with debts, gambling, an unstable man. The ledger disappeared. My requests were met with pauses, with the way men in power look at a woman who asks too many questions, like a loose thread that might unravel something better kept whole. They took more than my husband. They took our hearth, his job at the mill, my small column at the town paper where I wrote pieces on hygiene and common sense medicine. They took my reputation, tarnished it with hints that I had been loud, bitter, unreasonable. I watched my friends keep a distance, as if guilt were contagious. I had months of tears I could have drowned in, but I also had the ledger's absence pressing in on me like a living thing. I had the names Thomas had told me in the dark, the rhythm of his voice as he whispered conspiracies, and I had a stubbornness that had kept me alive through surgeries and shortages. I would not let his death be a footnote. I would not let the ledger be swallowed. That's when I started writing not for the town paper but for myself. Small falsified notices, inquiries disguised as gossip columns. I sent letters under assumed names. I prodded at the edges of the mine's operations by asking the women who sewed aprons for the miners about their husbands' hours. I learned to navigate around men who called me impertinent and gave the look that tried to shrink me. Thomas had always said that injustice has a sound, the muffled footfalls of people afraid to speak, the clink of coins when hands are smoothed. I listened. And then the outlaw came into my life with one of those things Thomas had feared and had hoped for. Jonah Black was an outlaw the kind of men tell each other about in saloons. A man with a crooked grin and a past that smelled like gunpowder and the open road. Folks saw a wanted poster and thought of violence. I saw a ledger. He didn't come to me with the ledger tucked safely in his boots. He came to me because I was the only one in Garrison Gulch who would speak his name without venom. An outlaw does not knock on a widow's door unless he has a reason to be brave or broken. Jonah looked neither wholly brave nor wholly broken. He looked tired. He had seen the kind of cruelty that leaves a person with a set jaw and an unwillingness to be kind for the sake of it. He said, "I've got what you're looking for," like a man who felt both guilty and relieved. I almost laughed at the audacity of trusting an outlaw. I almost told him to leave. But the ledger, Thomas's ledger, was more than ink and paper. It was a map to the men who had controlled our town with a fist of contracts and death. The ledger could clear more than my husband's name. It could expose a system that traded lives for coal seams and dividends. If Jonah had it, if he was willing to show it, then my grief became a strategy. I looked at him and I said carefully, "Show it to me then. But know this, I'm no one's pawn." There was a momentary private calculation behind his eyes. He tipped his hat in what might have been respect. We were not allies yet, but we began the conversation that would grow into a dangerous, unlikely alliance. In that first hour, I decided to accept his help. Not because I needed rescuing, but because sometimes the best way to rescue yourself is to accept what others offer, without abandoning your own agency. My hands may have been used to bandage wounds. Now they steadied my pen. My muscles were used to hauling water. Now they steadied a ledger. The ledger was a heavy thing for a woman who had been told to be small. It fit perfectly in my palm, and it fit perfectly into the story I would write. Even broken, I was not quiet. Even wounded, I could see the route forward. I had lost a husband, but I hadn't lost my mind. I had lost a home, but not my purpose. The outlaw who stood at my door did not save me with a sword. He offered me a piece of the truth. I took it, not because I lacked the ability to take it alone, but because I recognized the need for an alliance of skill and experience. I would keep my hands clean, and when I decided it was time to fight, it would be on my terms. Jonah's real name was a dozen other things to a dozen different people. Black for the shadow he cut across a room, Boone for an outlaw in Nebraska, John for a boy who laughed with reckless brightness. To me, he was Jonah because he swallowed down his guilt and kept moving. He told me he had the ledger because he'd been at the wrong place at the right time. A warehouse raid gone sideways. A ledger presumed lost that had found its way into his saddlebag. He didn't offer it like a peace treaty. He offered it like a bargaining chip. He wanted something in return. A chance at a different life, clean papers, the small kindness of being believed in. We reached our first accommodation the way two hardened people always do, with practical exchanges. He allowed me to glimpse the ledger under the lantern's flare. Names, sums, dates. The ledger's handwriting mirrored Thomas's notes so closely my chest ached with recognition. I read it like a surgeon reading an anatomy chart. This was not just bribery. This was a ledger of violence, of men bought off and men ordered away. There were names that matched those whispered in back rooms. Sheriff Aldridge, mine foreman Creel, the banker who handled Gentry's accounts. But more insidious were the dates and the patterns. Death clustered around union meetings and the days when miners tried to walk together. Jonah and I did not trust one another initially, but we needed each other. He had the ledger and the muscle to keep us from being overtaken while we used it. I had the voice that could put names to actions. He saved me from a quick, brutish end once when a pair of Gentry's men tracked him to my little house. He knocked loose a lantern and took a bullet meant for me. He left my bedroll soaked with blood and a promise. "I'm sorry," he said to the floorboards, and those words made him more human than any newspaper profile ever could. I had skills that made him respect me. When he was wounded and hid in the abandoned packing shed by the creek, I sutured a shallow wound with the firm fingers of someone who had sewn tendons back together in a field hospital. My hands smelled of iodine and tobacco and the faint grease from his coat the whole time. To his gang, medicine was superstition. To me, it was precision. His eyes, unaccustomed to being on the receiving end of care, softened with the recognition that I could do more than write an inflamed editorial. We escaped Garrison Gulch the night the sheriff's men came for me. I had a list of the men I believed to be involved, the names I'd compiled through gossip and grief, and the ledger's faint thumbprints. I had planned to print a draft that very morning, to distribute leaflets under the cover of dawn, to make the town awake to the ledger. Instead, a silhouette pressed against my window, a pair of boots on my porch, and the sheriff's voice in a head hollowed out by authority. Jonah's quick plan, smoke, a ladder through the back, the way he knew the terrain because he'd been a ghost on these roads, saved us. We fled under the sky like conspirators. The escape confirmed what we both suspected. This was not a job for a lone pen nor a lone pistol. We needed strategy, not song. We needed allies. But most of all, we needed each other's humility. He learned to listen to my logic as I drew out a plan on a scrap of paper. Where to go, how to set up safe posts, who to trust among the townsfolk. I learned the language of caution from him, the way he spoke of tracks and traps like a man who'd learned that second chances cost coin. We each taught the other to value a different skill. I showed him how to be still in a conversation and let the other person reveal themselves, a journalist's trick. He showed me how to move like someone who could disappear for days and return with the truth in his saddlebag. The more time we spent together, the more I saw him as a man who had made hard choices, sometimes necessary, often desperate. But crucially, he listened. When I said no, he accepted it. When I insisted on taking part of a plan, he adapted. He would not command me. He would not allow others to command me. He deferred to my knowledge of the ledger and my plan for its use. The respect he offered was not subservience. It was recognition. On a rain-slick ridge, we made a short camp under the protection of a pinyon tree. He sharpened a knife while I wrote a draft of my first public article in a code only I could read. We drank coffee that tasted like ash and plans and admitted small things into the dark. He told me of a boyhood spent in a town that called him reckless, and a mother who had given him a locket with a picture no man had ever seen. I told him about Thomas's laugh and the ledger's missing corner. We were not friends. We were two professionals bound by a mutual contract of necessity and a grudging affection that smelled of coffee and wounds. He saved me from violence more than once in those early days. I saved him from infection with splints and salves. On the road, people began to pick up on that. The outlaw and the widow turned partners in a thing greater than either of them. We were building trust by showing our competence to each other. There was no hero worship. There was only the slow accrual of faith. And faith, when practiced, builds courage. We learned to take risks together, to plan for contingencies, to accept defeat without looking away from the work. I had a pen, he had a ledger. Between them, we had enough weaponry to begin a fight that could topple more than corrupt men. We could topple the system that let them thrive. We found refuge in the kind of place people forget to guard, An old wash house 10 miles along a seldom-used logging track, its stones mossed and its roof patched by hands that cared more for function than for appearances. It smelled of damp wood and the faint sweetness of lavender the women who had once lived there used to hang to dry. The place suited me. It was small enough that my hands could make a difference in its order, and large enough that we could hide a ledger beneath a loose floorboard. It would be the first of many safe houses. A small clinical room for Jonah's wounds, a cramped corner where I could write without being watched. Healing, I had learned, isn't grand. It's the repetition of small, careful tasks. A poultice, a stitch, a cup of warm broth handed when the fever spikes. In that outbuilding, I returned to the things that had kept me useful before love and loss rearranged my life. The measured calm of applying antiseptic, the precise way to wrap a sprain so swelling might be given a chance. I set up an improvised clinic. I taught Jonah the names of yellow herbs that stop bleeding and the exact point where a bandage should compress. He learned to trust someone who was not the town's moral compass, but a professional with calloused thumbs and an insistence on cleanliness. While my hands were busy, my brain rewired. I started a weekly broadsheet under a false imprint, anonymously distributed leaflets we nicked into town markets at dawn. I wrote columns not only about hygiene, but about truth. I wrote about the miners as if their stories mattered, the men who had names and mothers and debts and dreams. My words were a lamp, not a spotlight. I wrote about how the mine's carts moved with schedules at night to places already buried between contracts and bank accounts. I published small, verifiable facts and left space for outrage to fester. Outrage in a town that had grown used to quiet could be a dangerous friend. Those days in the wash house, I started to change my clothes. The soft, high-necked blouses, which once felt like armor, were boxed and exchanged for work dresses hemmed to the knee and thick boots that didn't fit me when I tried them in youth. My hair, once pinned with the diligence of a woman who expected to manage appearances, was tied back with a leather thong so it would not get caught when I tightened a tourniquet. There is a kind of visible change that happens when a woman takes herself seriously. She dresses for her tasks. I learned to carry a small leather satchel with bandages beside my notebook. My apron was stained with iodine and ink in equal measure. The outbuilding became a small school of women's competence. Word traveled in measured whispers. Widow Callahan, who had a parlor smile but a backbone of iron, started bringing tea and a ledger of her own that lamplight had revealed. Receipts, numbers, the way a town's women can add up things men pretend to overlook. Mary Locke, a widow younger than me with eyes like a sparrow's, offered to run errands that required a cheerful face. An older woman named Esther, small as a fist but twice as stubborn, taught me how to mend boot leather with such an absence of fuss it felt sacrilegious to call it skill. Women arrived with small things: herbs, a spool of thread, a story that might fit into my column. They stayed because they recognized in me a woman who had been wronged and would not be kept meek. The ledger, under a board wedged loose, pulsed like a hidden heart. We read it by candlelight, and with every name we made a plan. We mapped who could be called to testify, who owed what coin to whom, who had been bought with promises of daughters' dowries and farm leases. I listened to the women around me, and I made certain choices. We would not be loud for the sake of noise. We would be careful. We would use what respect we had, and the respect we did not, to construct a net that could catch those who thought they were untouchable. I taught a small class on basic first aid in the wash house loft, with chairs scavenged from an abandoned schoolhouse. I taught them how to dress wounds, how to keep a fevered man upright, how to copy a signature close enough to buy time and grant space for truth to work. The women learned fast, their hands reshaping experience into power. It was a peculiar kind of revolution, not the banging of spurs and the thunder of pistols, but the steady click of needles and the quiet crossing out of lies in a ledger. They practiced signatures that would stand up to bank officers, and they learned how to watch men who came into their kitchens with apologies that smelled of flattery. In the quiet of the night, when the women had retired and Jonah washed his own wounds, I wrote my editorials. I grew bolder. I started to risk my name in the margins under the thin guise of a different author. I published small stories about missing men, about paydays that were always silent of certain transactions. I did not scream fraud into the night. I fed the town's curiosity and let it simmer. I balanced outrage with care because people in this valley were tethered to their gaslights and income, and recklessness could cost more lives. Jonah stayed, partly because he trusted his life to my needle, partly because he saw how good I was with plans, and partly because he himself believed in a ledger's power to upend men like Gentry. But as the days turned into weeks, our relationship altered. It was not the swift flowering of a romance sold in dime novels. It was a slow recognition of competence, of laughter over bad coffee, of nights where we compared the calluses on our hands like medals. He once made me a crude wooden stool after a week of fever had left him idle. I painted it and used it by the stove. In that small exchange, a language of respect and care took root. I was no longer just a woman who had been wronged. I was becoming a woman whose hands held tools, whose words had teeth, whose friends were not only those who agreed, but those who acted. I healed and I wrote. I planned and I practiced. I was discovering not a salvation, but a steady, stubborn competence that would keep me moving when the night came. Jonah's past was not a single wound. It was a map of missteps and necessities. He had been a courier for men who posed as respectable and consulted for others who kept their businesses clean by not asking too many questions. He had learned the routes that avoided roadblocks and the men who would look away if a ledger was tucked in a sack with the right gate. His skills, smuggling, forging passes, knowing which bank manager slept with which ledger, became tools in the service of something larger than himself. He once told me, while we packed flasks and bread in silence, "I carried men's lies for years. Never thought I'd be carrying the truth." What made Jonah useful was not only his past, but the humility with which he offered it. He never claimed to be a savior. He saw himself as someone who had learned a practical set of skills by necessity, and who could now deploy them toward a cause that mattered to someone else. When I laid out my plan to infiltrate a bank's locked ledgers, he did not scoff. He offered a route and a way to distract two guards by staging a small skirmish with splints of nothing. He trusted my judgment because I had shown him how to gather evidence like a surgeon gathers data: precise, clinical, decisive. There were mornings when we would map our actions like surgeons in a pre-op, with me listing facts and him describing routes. I decided which pages of the ledger could be published safely without getting us lynched or leaving witnesses exposed. Jonah arranged for forged passes that looked like funeral notices, and he taught a pair of women who could mimic signatures how to copy bank entries that would allow us to move money in covert channels. The more I asked him to adapt his old life to this one, the more he did it, not because I was sovereign over him, but because he believed in the ledger's power to right something wrong. He had a past he needed to atone for. I had a husband's death I needed to be more than a memory. His skills served my story, but he never made decisions for me. When we debated whether to put certain names to paper, he deferred to my sense of moral calculus. He said once, "If you think a name should be printed, then print it. If you think it shouldn't, then don't." He respected the weight of my choices because he had watched me risk things that mattered, like arming the women with knowledge of stitches and signatures. He had watched me sit a young miner's wife down and teach her how to read a contract so no man could slip lies under a daughter's dowry. He respected competence as currency. Our attraction grew like a slow wildfire, not the city anvil flash of lust you read about. It was the way he would hold a lantern for me when the night was thick, the way he learned the names of the herbs I favored, the way he would return with a boiled root when a fever took someone. It was also the way he learned to shut up at the right moments. He would let me speak my mind without interruption. He learned to ask questions and to accept my answers, even when they were decisions that put both of us at risk. He saw in me a moral anchor, a woman who would not be bought and who would hold a ledger like a lit candle until the room was bright enough for others to see. When a banker's vault had to be breached for evidence of payments, it was Jonah's knowledge of night watchmen and lock mechanisms that got us in. He did not gloat. He helped me place the evidence into safe hands. Women who would courier documents to a sympathetic editor in a distant county. Men who would smuggle copies into the state capitol. We were making sure the ledger was not a weapon for our revenge, but a map toward lawful exposure. To him, weapons meant destruction. To me, words were more dangerous and more precise. That balance kept us from becoming caricatures of ourselves. And there were moments when his history was a burden we had to carry together. He had enemies who remembered him as a thief and nothing else. There were men who had lost money because of him, and their memory made them dangerous allies to the likes of Gentry and Aldridge. He faced those men with a steadiness that did not rely on bravado. When a gang we had once run with rode into a nearby town to stake out Jonah, he came to me and said simply, "I might be a target." I answered, "Then we make sure the target has to work harder than they imagine." He liked that. He liked that his rough edges fit into my careful plans, and that my plans had room for mercy. The ledger's secrets were laid bare by the combination of his sinuous experience and my unblinking curiosity. He recognized names, men who had paid to keep their hands off bodies, others who had paid hands to silence witnesses. With his contacts and my published facts, we began to assemble proof that could actually see a courtroom, or at least a public tribunal in the town square. The ledger was becoming less an object and more a pivot point. And through it all, Jonah never tried to claim my anger or my agenda. He never offered to bear my burden as a favor. He bore part of it because he believed in what it represented. He learned from me what it meant to pick a fight for someone else's justice rather than for one's own survival. He softened, not because I fixed him, but because I presented him with a moral architecture he chose to inhabit. He taught me that a man who respects a woman's agency is a rare thing, and that such respect can be more transformative than any grand speech. His past served my story. His redemption became a side effect of the work. We both changed because we were asked to do hard, careful things together. He protected the ledger with a thief's cunning and a repentant man's heart. I translated it into words that could not be silenced. In that partnership, I found a new kind of power, one that did not make me soft or brittle, but steady and true. The ledger's entries began to form a picture that was uglier than I expected. Not just greedy men, but a system where violence was an accounting practice. I traced payments that coincided with disappearances and accidents. Men who pushed for safer shafts or for equitable shares had the price of their descent quietly transferred into the ledgers and subsequently met with sudden misfortunes. Thomas's name was in the margins in a hurried scrawl, the date a week before he died, a payment that made no sense. I felt for a heartbeat, the particular intimate ache of betrayal, how the world could use bookkeeping to order a man's end. As I dug further, I found patterns that tied Sheriff Aldridge tightly to Gentry's accounts. The sheriff was a man with a badge riven with self-importance who had learned to interpret law as favor. He was a man who smiled at mothers at funerals and then stamped signatures on warrants that were thin as paper. Creel the foreman had been a man who believed intimidation was a management strategy. The banker, Mr. Harmon, balanced ledgers with a steady hand and a criminal studiedness. These men had built a small empire where truth was paid for and silenced when inconvenient. My fight was not merely personal, it became a civic duty. The ledger represented a contract signed in blood, and the ledger could be read in the court of public opinion if I could get enough ink into enough hands. I began to shape my articles into a crescendo of truth. I framed them not as vendettas, but as evidence-based indictments. I was careful. Too many had suffered from reckless accusation, but I had a ledger, and I had witnesses. A miner's widow had kept a receipt of a shipment of safety gear that never arrived. A clerk at Gentry's office had written down a ledger discrepancy and then been transferred to a remote outpost. These were the skeletons I exposed, one careful column at a time. There were nights when my anger felt like a live thing beneath my ribs, jittering and hot. I wanted to burn the town down sometimes, to set every gilded machine alight so the equalities would come pouring out, but setting things on fire would not bring Thomas back. Setting a good plan into motion might. So I turned rage into lists, to cross-examines, to the slow, patient amassing of testimony. I turned my grief into a narrow, sharp instrument. Jonah supported my plan, not as a guard, but as a partner in strategy. He would sometimes say, "You know what you're doing, Mara. Don't let it get you." He meant protect the ledger, protect witnesses, protect yourself. He also respected that this fight belonged to me. He was there because he chose to be, not because my pain cast a net he could not escape. He urged caution when I wanted to throw names into the square, and he matched my audacity when subtlety failed. He taught me how to read a trap, how to know when silence was a choice rather than fear. But the ledger made us dangerous, and danger came on heavy hooves. Men who had profited from deaths preferred to keep the cost low. They called me hysterical behind my back and a meddling widow to my face. A rival journalist, Malachi Wren, wrote a scathing piece painting me as an opportunist, a widow who turned grief into gossip. He had once been a friend. He had once taken tea with me and complimented Thomas's laugh. Now he parroted the town's defenses against truth. Women in the town did not all stand with me at once. Fear is contagious. I could see in their faces the calculation of children's futures and the hunger for security. To some, I offered only the ledger's facts. To others, a plan to protect their income while the scandal broke. Slowly, they began to trust. They brought to me small pieces of evidence, a canceled check, a ledger line in a different hand, a name scratched into a wall, that when combined offered a picture of complicity. It was quiet work, threading needles through the eyes of men who had not counted small things. The hardest part of this phase of my life was articulating why I could not let Thomas's death become a single sentence in a town's long list of fatalities. I would not let his name be swallowed. I wanted justice, not vengeance. Justice required witnesses and time, not guns and screams. I knew that to ask the town for its attention was to ask women and men to gamble with livelihoods. This is why I took my plan to Jonah and the women and made it our plan, not mine alone. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and Jonah washed a basin with hands steady and certain, I read aloud a draft of a piece I intended to slip under the door of every household. It was titled plainly, "On the Economics of Silence." I argued in blunt, unemotional sentences that the ledger demonstrated a practice of purchasing silence and engineering accidents. I included names and dates and asked how many more deaths would be required before a town would pick a side. The women listened, and one by one they offered edits that made my argument sharper. They offered their stories, their grudges, their small indignities. When the piece went out at dawn, it landed like a stone into a still pond and made ripples that could not be smoothed. My anger had sharpened into a tool of truth. I was no longer just a woman with a ledger. I was a woman with a purpose and a map. The fight was defined not by how loudly I proclaimed it, but by how precisely I moved. If I failed now, it would not be because I lacked fire. It would be because I had been careless. I would not be careless. I had stitched wounds that would not hold unless one used the right thread. I had learned to be meticulous. So I kept folding anger into plans, and I kept Jonah by my side, not as a knight, but as an equal who believed in the ledger's language. We were partners in a campaign where the victory would be medicine for more than one broken heart. We made lists like surgeons make lists before an operation. Each item was a potential complication. We assigned roles based on skill. I would write and gather testimony. Jonah would retrieve physical evidence and arrange safe passages. The women would provide alibis, courier copies, and homes where witnesses could sleep without fear. This division of labor was not a concession to gendered expectations. It was an acknowledgement of expertise. In our small band, credit was not currency, competence was. We planned the release of the ledger in stages. First, we had to be certain we could survive the immediate backlash from the allied men who benefited from the ledger's silences. So Jonah and I plotted diversions, a staged fight in a neighboring hamlet that would draw Aldridge's men away long enough for us to slip certain copies into the hands of a sympathetic editor in a larger town. It was his knowledge of timing, when a patrol rotated which way horses would be sent, that allowed us safe movement. He trusted my language to frame the ledger in the public mind. He trusted my caution not to leave unprotected witnesses exposed. There were evenings when our partnership was a gentle, private thing. After a day of long meetings with women who had seen men vanish into mine shafts or into night trains, Jonah and I would sit on the washhouse stoop and peel apples. He had a way of listening that made me feel seen but never owned. He asked about Thomas not as a curiosity, but for the sake of understanding the person who had shaped me. He occasionally misstepped. He would offer a solution that would have required me to give up control, and I would tell him plainly why it wouldn't do. He accepted these refusals like a man who had learned he would never be a master of all the things he loved. Similarly, when his plans relied on methods I thought too ugly, I would argue until he saw the moral line we refused to cross. He learned to let me say my piece and to measure his own choices by my standards. We began to heal each other's old wounds in practical ways. Jonah taught me how to read horse tracks, how to know when a scent leads to a lie. He taught me the value of silence as more than an absence. I taught him how to administer a sedative that would not kill, how to stitch an artery, how to sew a small patch so that a coat would look whole and not draw suspicion. We swapped tools of trade like lovers, exchanged small jewelry, a sharpened compass for a handwriting guide. There was romance, but it was built from mutual respect. Late-night conversations that left both of us made smaller by the knowledge of the other, hands that found each other over bandages and papers. We also taught each other things neither of us knew. Jonah learned to listen to a woman's way of negotiating, how small concessions could buy a larger victory, and implemented it in a way that surprised him with its effectiveness. I learned from Jonah the art of contingency, how to plan not for one future, but for the many ways a plan can fail. When Aldridge tried to use the town's fear against us by planting phony threats, Jonah's counter-moves were surgical. His gang, small, loyal folk who had reasons to be redeemed, acted with discipline we had cultivated together. Our strategy deepened the bonds between our group. Widow Callahan became our primary courier, and her familiarity with the town's habits allowed her to slip letters under washboards and into bread tins without suspicion. Esther, the leather woman, forged occupation papers that I could hand to witnesses facing threats of deportation by bank summons. Mary Locke, who had once been afraid of her own voice, now stood and testified in small rooms where men tried to limit her, and the steadiness of her voice changed how men listened. In one of our most daring moves, we staged a community meeting under the pretense of discussing a new irrigation scheme. I sat at the front as if to speak about water. Instead, I spoke about men who had disappeared and about a ledger that proved bribery and false accidents. Jonah had placed a trusted man in the doorway, a former miner who now ran a bakery, who would hand out copies during the swirl of people's exodus. We were careful not to declare ourselves as an army. We wanted to create a sense of truth that would spark action rather than invite immediate bloodshed. Our romance continued to grow in the margins of battle plans. It was less about declarations than about small gestures. Jonah would knot a neckerchief in my hair on a windy night. I would bake him a dense bread after he had been awake all night. There were tender contradictions. He was an outlaw who had once robbed to survive. I was a journalist who prized law and witness. Yet we balanced each other. When he grew cynical, an occupational hazard, my moral clarity steadied him. When I hesitated, his courage reminded me why I had begun this. We were equal in the way that matters, in decision and in danger. When a plan risked exposure of a key witness, we argued openly in the washhouse. It was painful, but the argument was in service to a common cause, and we reached decisions together. He respected the fact that I would make a hard choice and do it, and I respected that he could execute a dangerous move without crying for my permission. When I asked him to slow down, he slowed. When he asked me to be daring, I went with him because I trusted his judgment. This partnership, made of skill and stubbornness, of careful cruelty and necessary mercy, brought more women into its orbit. Their solidarity became a force that could not be easily smeared away. It was practical and material, transportation, paper, testimony, but it was also moral. In our alliance, each of us found a place to be useful, and in usefulness we found dignity. There are decisions that feel as though a life hinges upon a coin's toss. I had one such coin in my hand, the choice between safety and justice. Jonah, ever my mirror of caution, set the options before me with the bluntness of a man who had seen both ends. "We can take the ledger and leave," he said one dusk as we watched the town's light shimmer at the valley's mouth. "We can cross state lines, set up somewhere no man knows us, and you can write under a new name. Or we can go forward and expose them." Exile was tempting in a way that felt luxurious after months of fear. The idea of a new place that would not know Thomas's name, a place where my age would count for experience and not for scandal, there was a wistful charm in the fantasy. Jonah sometimes spoke of this life as if it were a coastline accessible only by ship. He could give me the route. He could offer me a clean slate. He could offer me a quiet home where our hands would ache only from labor, and our worries would be of crops and not of ledgers. But exile would mean leaving other women to the mercy of men who engineered accidents for labor-saving profit. It would mean leaving the ledger's truth unlit in Garrison Gulch, a smoldering ember that might ignite again only in another decade. My grief had been personal, but in the months since Thomas's death, it had expanded into a civic grief. I had come to see that a single ledger was not a personal totem, but a public record. To run was to shirk the duty I had assumed the night I took the ledger into my hands. I thought of the way Mary had looked at me that morning, her fingers working through the last of a man's shirt, her voice flat with exhaustion. I thought of Esther's small, fierce eyes and the way she had said, "We don't need more women who know how to make things pretty. We need women who know how to say no." Their courage steadied me in a way exile's promise could not. I thought of Thomas's laughter and I realized that justice was not vengeance. It was restoration. A ledger left in the dark would let the same men use the same ledgers on another family. When I stood at the washhouse door that night and looked at Jonah, I said, "We stay." My voice did not tremble. It carried the weight of the ledger and the women behind me. Jonah's eyes searched mine not for command, but for consent. And when he nodded, it was with the quiet of a man who trusted the woman at his side. He said, "Then we make sure it's worth it." That decision changed us in small ways. We began to plan for the long haul, how to protect witnesses, how to redistribute risk so no single person bore the brunt of exposure. We rehearsed scenarios. We made sure the ledger's copies were hidden in places no man would suspect. Inside the binding of a hymnal, sewn into a child's doll, coded into the pattern of a quilt. We also started to imagine a life beyond the ledger, a life where our days were not consumed by danger, but by a balance of work and pleasure. We let ourselves dream of storms and summer alike. In our private moments of imagined futures, Jonah and I were less a wanted duo and more a partnership of equals. We talked about a small property far across the divide, a place with a creek and a room for a clinic, and a desk for a paper. We imagined the clothes we would wear, work shirts threaded with professional purpose, not the fragile undergarments of youth. We pictured a place where we could be older and unfearful, where our rough hands would be counted as assets rather than marks against our beauty. Yet there was laced into our dream the knowledge that the moment of choice demanded sacrifice. The ledger was not only a record, but a moral demand. We could accept exile for safety, and it would feel like an admission that truth could be purchased by flight. Or we could stay and risk everything to maintain the moral weather. I chose the weather. For a brief, almost perfumed hour, we allowed ourselves happiness. We picnicked on a hillside, and I taught Jonah how to identify edible roots. He showed me a trick where one could make coffee that tasted less like mud and more like something worth waking for. We laughed at small things, at a misremembered line from a hymn, and the way a hawk dove above us as if to remind us of the sky. It was the kind of happiness that did not erase dread, but refortified us for the day ahead. The calm did not prevent the storm, but it steeled us. The ledger's publication would bring consequences. Aldridge would not take kindly to being exposed. Gentry would not like a public ledger that told of his payments in blood. Our choice to stay meant we accepted the probability of pain. It also meant that we accepted each other fully, as equals who would share both the shame of setbacks and the sweetness of eventual victories. In the weeks that followed, the air felt taut with possibilities. We set our plan in motion, and the ledger became a compass. We did not know if the town would rally, if the state would intervene, or if men like Gentry would simply resort to more brutal measures to protect their empires. But choices are made in the light of limited information. We had done the math for courage. It was enough. Gentry was resourceful in ways that were obscene. He had friends who ran stage lines, who owned saloons, who could dampen suspicion with a smile and a round of whiskey. Sheriff Aldridge had proven himself not merely corrupt but personally invested in the maintenance of the status quo. They were men who measured their influence in ledgers and were willing to spend currency to ensure silence. I had expected resistance, but I had not fully anticipated the complexity of the conspiracy that would coalesce against us. The first strike was economic. Mr. Harmon, the banker, froze several accounts belonging to women who had aided our cause, claiming clerical errors. The women lost small sums of cash that represented a month's food. Then came legal pressure. Subpoenas piled like gray snow on doorsteps of witnesses, thin masks of legitimacy used to bully mouths shut. Aldridge cut off our legal right to print certain accusations by citing public safety. I wrote anyway, in coded prose and under assumed names. I printed facts that could not be pursued in court without calling a dozen men to testify. I used small truths to build big pictures and let the town's curiosity pick at the wounds. Gentry did not limit himself to lawfare. He employed men who would make nights bad for us in a comfortable way. Horses were let loose from their stables. Fenestrations of windows were broken on silent evenings. And when Jonah's old acquaintance, Huck Tate, a man with anger like a coiled spring, found out Jonah was working against men who had once been collaborators, he came to town with a small band and intentions worse than confrontation. What cut deep was personal betrayal. Malachi Wren, my rival journalist turned coward, accepted a silver coin and a smear to write that I was a woman ruined by her own bitterness. He published an op-ed that called me a spinster of grievance. It was an attempt to reduce me to a caricature. It was a familiar tactic, but it stung. Betrayal from one who once toasted my columns felt like a ledge thrown away beneath my feet. I could have let it fracture me. Instead, I sat at my desk and rewrote with a calm so precise it was a blade. I printed names with incontrovertible proof, and the town's reaction began to fracture along lines I could not fully predict. As alliances formed to oppose us, some strange ones formed to aid us. A local schoolmaster who had been overly cautious suddenly produced a list of men who'd been absent on certain payment dates. A saloon girl, whose livelihood would have been threatened by exposure, came forward with a story that changed the tone of a hearing we'd arranged. These were acts of bravery that were not grand in outward appearance but seismic in their consequences. The ledger gave people permission to be brave, but the opposition escalated. Aldridge arrested Jonah's closest ally on trumped-up charges. Huck Tate's gang staged an ambush in the logging road that left our courier's horse dead and the courier with a broken arm. Our safe houses were compromised. We moved the ledger from one hiding place to another. The panic was contagious. Women who had once whispered at kitchen tables began to close their curtains more tightly. Fear held a leash to courage. Despite the pressure, I refused to be intimidated. I remember kneeling at the bedside of a 30-year-old miner's wife with a child on her hip and telling her the ledger's truth in plain terms. I said, "If we do nothing, they will keep doing this. If we speak, we have a chance to stop it." She looked at me with tears that were not only fear, but a kind of decision being formed. She agreed to testify. Every victory came at a cost. Jonah learned that someone close to him had been used by Gentry to find his whereabouts. The man, quiet, humble Charlie, had been offered coin and safety for his loyalty. He had chosen a small security and had died for it in a way that made us both pay taxes of regret. Jonah's anger after that loss was a low flame. It warmed us with purpose, but could have burned us if not handled with care. A big break arrived when the women, increasingly mobile and clever, smuggled a copy of the ledger to a regional paper. The editor, an old friend of Thomas's, who owed a debt to truth, printed a careful exposé. The article reframed the ledger as evidence and not as libel. It named names and asked questions that could not be politely ignored. The state capitol buzzed, and papers from other counties began to ask how a small valley could harbor such corruption. That external attention saved us in a way. The governor's office sent an emissary with orders to review the sheriff's activities. But the town is a combustible thing. Attention can heal and ignite. It was like holding a fire near a powder keg. You never know which you'll get. Aldridge retaliated with an attempt to classify Jonah as outside the law in a way that would justify summary imprisonment. He took the gamble of public opinion and lost some ground. By the time the state emissary arrived, the town had split. Gentry still had his private levers, but the voices of women with receipts and miners with evidence had multiplied. Some of the town's men, who had long accepted the mine's dominance, were now forced to reconcile their incomes with their consciences. They were the ones who began to talk privately in ways that once would have stayed lodged in the dark. Through all this, Jonah never tried to take the ledger and run. He resisted male temptations to make this a tale of his redemption alone. He stayed with me in planning rooms and laundry rooms and basements. He asked for nothing he could not earn. He offered his skills and his steadiness. When the forces conspired, we did not fracture. We fortified. There was a night when everything we had built seemed to loosen like a rope burned at the end. It came quickly, an ambush masquerading as justice. A rumor planted in the paper said that the ledger was a forgery. Malachi Wren took the bait and amplified it with a wink and a smirk. And suddenly our hard-gathered witnesses began to doubt themselves. The bank seized copies of our documents under the pretense of an audit. The state emissary delayed hearings citing procedural concerns. We felt the breath of institutional inertia against our necks. Worse, there was betrayal from within our own house of trust. Callahan's courier, Quiet Susan, was found to have been coerced by threats to her children. She confessed, tearful and broken, that she had handed a copy of the ledger to men who promised her family money and safety. The men had taken it to Aldridge and then used it as a pretext to move against Jonah. He was arrested in the middle of the night, dragged from his bed with rust on the cuffs and silence in the courthouse. Jonah's arrest was a theater of cruelty. They shackled him with a show of law and dragged him through streets that once saw him as a specter of menace and now saw him as a villain reduced. He looked at me through iron bars, his eyes a mix of fury and pleading. He had always known the cost of this life. Still, watching him taken in chains felt like watching a man's shadow be nailed to a wall. My heart kicked against the bars of panic. I had to decide then, run with him to mount a rescue, or stand and fight in the courts and the press. Jonah made it easier in a way I hadn't expected. He looked at me and said, "Go do what you do best, Mara." It was a relinquishment of agency to me, and I could feel its weight. He was not asking me to save him because he needed saving. He was asking me to continue the fight he had become part of. That clarity steadied me more than a pistol. We tried legal counsel. A lawyer came who had once been an ally and now was compromised by a bribe. The hearing was a sham. The sheriff played on the town's fear for order and painted Jonah as an irredeemable thief who endangered women and children. The magistrate, who had been bought a new coat and a promissory letter, ruled that Jonah be held until evidence could be proved. The ledger, still at large in boxes of its own copies, was declared under investigation. I felt a loneliness I had not believed possible. The women around me showed up at court, shivering with righteous rage. Mary testified in a voice brittle but brave. Esther offered a rough affidavit. The public pressure built, but so did the legal tricks. Aldridge promised quick justice if the town would comply. It was a legal theater designed to drain our stamina. I felt myself diminishing into a woman who had traded her days for a courtroom's slow grind. The worst blow landed when a man we had counted as an ally, Tom Fletcher, a miner with a boyish grin, turned up dead in a ditch. It was made to look like an accident. The narrative already prepared. He had been drunk, he had wandered, was swift and quiet, and the town's memory accepted it. But in the wash house, we knew better. The ledger's pattern repeated itself. We knew the language of these deaths. The silence, the misdirection, the disposal. Grief is a repetitive muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes, but it also hurts the places of your body where you try to be soft. For a moment, I thought about packing the ledger, Jonah's name, our dreams in my satchel, and disappearing across the border. The easy road is always fancied at a person's weakest hour, but grief has a strange effect. It sharpens the sense of what must be done. I thought of the women who had come forward because they trusted me. I thought of a town that might still remember Thomas not as a scandal, but as a man who tried to make their world safer. I decided then that surrender was not a choice I had the right to make. The night I resolved to fight rather than flee, I sat on the floor of the wash house with the ledger and a pen. I wrote in tight, measured script the names of men who had promised me loyalty and had instead sold us out. I wrote the names of the allies who had stood and the ones who had faltered. I wrote a plea for the state to see its own responsibility. I sealed the page and handed it to Esther, with a request that would cost her much. Get this to the Capitol, and if you are caught, tell them it was a false lead. When Jonah's trial began, the mood in the town was like a low drum roll. The state emissary, perhaps moved enough by our evidence or by the pressure of the papers, allowed testimony. But the magistrate was slow, and delay was victory for men with money. The sheriff's men whispered in corners. A curate refused to read our names in Sunday service. Hope began sticking to itself in threads. In the deepest hour, I realized that the ledger's power was not in our possession alone. It lay in the courage of those who would use it. The ledger belonged to the people it spoke for, not to me or Jonah or any single soul. It belonged to every miner who had been silenced and every woman who had mended a wound in secret. That understanding rebalanced my panic into a strategy. I would not lead a raid to free Jonah. I would lead a strategy that made the public see the ludicrousness of holding a man in chains while the men who bought silence walked free. I refused to be silenced. I refused to trade another person's life for my comfort. The ledger still breathed beneath floorboards, and the women still had courage in their hands. We were bruised but not broken. The darkest hour was not an end. It was an invitation to the kind of planning that could outlast cruelty. A rescue, if it is to be worth the cost, should not be a spectacle of bravado. It should be surgical, exacting, and built on the strengths of people who know their work. I took the ledger and I made it into a plan that could not be simply undone by hired men and bought magistrates. First, we ensured there were copies. Then we set a stage for the town itself to see what we had seen. We needed a spectacle of truth rather than violence, a way to make denial impossible. I convened the women in the washhouse loft and assigned roles like a captain dividing a crew. Some would infiltrate the courthouse in plain sight as witnesses. Callahan's shawl makers, who had become adept at waiting, would sit in the pews and hand out copies of testimony like communion wafers. Mary Locke would stand at a window and note guard rotations in shorthand. Esther would attach a note to a courier's horse that would reach the state emissary in the capital. I would present the ledger in the town square if it came to it. Jonah would be key in ensuring we had physical control of certain doors and men. The plan wasn't a rescue of a man. It was an exposure that would make his detention a liability to those who had detained him. The night before everything changed, I lay awake and considered the nature of leadership. Leaders are often imagined as loud and solitary, yet true leadership is a matter of coordination and listening. I thought of the women I had taught, how confidently they could now stitch a wound or write a deposition. They would lead in their own way. I thought of Jonah, sitting in a cell with a bandage on his arm from Huck Tate's ambush, and felt a fierce love that was not about possession, but about mutual elevation. I resolved to lead in a way that was true to us. The plan unfolded on a Wednesday, a day ordinary enough that men would be complacent. The courthouse had been painted fresh for the sheriff's wife's arrival. Aldridge never imagined the very citizens he policed would turn the courthouse into a theater of accusation. We had appointed a group of women to stand and speak at a public hearing, supposedly called to discuss a new road. I drafted them lines that were simple and grounded: names, dates, receipts. The ledger was to be presented not as an accusation, but as an accounting. When the women stood, voices like cords pulled tight and then released. The room felt different. People shifted. Men who had been drunk in back rooms straightened. Those who had made a living from silence squinted at the handwriting, and something like a doubt crept across their faces. The ledger pages were placed on the prosecutor's desk, and the prosecutor, flummoxed, had to take them. A hush fell so dense I could have heard a man fidget. At the same time, Jonah's small, precise crew executed a series of diversions that kept Aldridge's reinforcements occupied. They blocked the old bridge and set a wagon in a way that would require time to remove. They were not trying to fight, they were trying to slow. Jonah's gang scared and confused men who had been used to being the town's muscle. He handled the task with the precision of someone who had labored for years to move goods rather than people. The final stroke was the most delicate. We had ensured there would be a witness who could tie Aldridge directly to payments from gentry. A woman named Liza had been employed in the mine's lodge kitchen and had seen receipts passed in the shadows. She had been terrified to speak. With a hand that trembled but did not fail, she took the stand and read the names. Her voice broke at the first word and grew strong at the last. The ledger, our ledger, was not a scrap of paper anymore. It was a public instrument. The room did not break into the kind of lawless violence Gentry's men had hoped for. Instead, it went quiet, and then, slowly, began to ask questions. The state emissary arrived in time to witness a public spectacle that could not be spun away. He took the ledger and ordered a temporary suspension of Aldridge pending inquiry. This was not an instant victory. It was a window of accountability, but it was a window we had earned. Jonah was released on a technicality when his jailer's corruption was exposed in the light of the ledger's evidence. He walked out of the courthouse with dirt and bandages on his hands, and he walked in the sunlight as a man who had been remade not by my protection but by our shared action. Women, who would have been sidelined in other eras, led the charge in this town's rebirth. The seamstresses, who had once been invisible, now had voices that mattered. Esther's affidavit had proved to be the hinge upon which a number of other things turned. The men who had been our opponents were not all vanquished. Some fled, some tried to bargain, some accepted the new reality. But the ledger's contents were now public things. It would take time to undo the damage done by years of quiet corruption, but the city had begun to turn. In the flurry after the courtroom, the town felt different. People who had been cowed found reasons to look one another in the eye. Those who had benefited from silence found their privilege policed by new eyes. The mine could not operate as it had without men to work it, and those men now had a record to hold above their heads. The ledger did its slow, relentless job of clarifying. I was not the single architect of victory. I was a coordinator, a woman who had stitched a net and taught others to hold the ropes. I had patience and witnesses and women who had learned to fight through the steady work of competence. Jonah stood beside me, not at my feet, not above my head, but shoulder to shoulder. In the wash house later, we looked at each other with a worn and honest gratitude. He took my hand like a man who had learned to be humble and brave. He said, "We did it." I said, "We did it together." It was a simple truth. We had won something that mattered. The ledger had served its purpose. The men who had been responsible for buying silence and engineering death were not all brought to the gallows, but their methods were exposed and no longer invisible. The town would recover at its own pace, but it would recover. And in the middle of that recovery, I found love not as a completion, but as a partnership. Jonah and I were both altered and both the agents of that alteration. The consequence of a public ledger is an avalanche of small reckonings. There were inquiries and hearings and men who found themselves in uncomfortable chairs, answering simple questions under oath. Gentry tried to hire lawyers who promised obfuscation. Aldridge attempted to rally a few frightened supporters to paint the ledger as a fiction. But public exposure has teeth. When men are forced to explain payments under a light too bright for bribery, excuses become thin. The state emissary convened an inquiry, and the ledger was entered as primary evidence. Courtrooms, unlike saloons, are rooms that demand careful words. I watched the proceedings with the same clinical attention with which I had once watched a patient's pulse. I wrote with sharp hands. My pieces during this time were not the rhetorical flourishes of a younger woman. They were measured, full of references and witnesses and cross-examinations. They called out systems and demanded change. They did not punish with vengeance. They sought structural shifts, reforms in how mining contracts were handled, protections for whistleblowers, the kind of ordinances that might prevent ledgers of death in other valleys. Jonah's name came up frequently. He was not listed as a victim in the way a widow might be mourned. He was a man who had chosen a different path and now stood to be judged by the society he had once wronged. He testified, with a humility and a clarity that surprised many. He explained his past, his choices, and the ledger's acquisition. He did not expect absolution. He wanted only to be honest, and to show that the ledger was evidence of larger crimes. His testimony helped shape the case, but it also spurred his own redemption by the slow accreditation of truth. There were moments of ugly pushback. Men who had been indicted attempted to sway jurors with threats and busybodies with cash. There were nights where my name was slurred again in taverns and letters threatening the women who had testified were left on doorsteps. But women who had been taught to stitch wounds now bandaged each other's confidence. The solidarity that had been cultivated in the wash house steadied those who might have otherwise been bowed. The town's moral center began to shift as small acts of courage coalesced into policy. The hearing culminated in a day when the magistrate read findings that would echo beyond Garrison Gulch. Several men were indicted on counts ranging from bribery to manslaughter. The bank was found to have facilitated suspicious transfers and was fined. The sheriff was suspended pending criminal charges. I did not expect instant justice. No woman does if she has learned the nature of systems. But I felt the vindication of seeing records and witness statements laid flat in a courtroom and acknowledged. The ledger had been a tool of accountability. After the legal dust settled into a dull hum, the town began to make tangible changes. Unions were allowed to form without fear of violent suppression. A fund was set up, seeded by a combination of fines and a small grant from the state, to support families of those who had been lost or injured. A group of women began a cooperative, selling goods that would keep money in the hands of widows rather than in the pockets of a few. I used whatever small income I had left to fund a weekly column dedicated to civic rights and common sense law. The ledger had not only shamed men, it had produced the scaffolding for a better set of rules. Love, too, had its reckoning. Jonah did not become a man without flaws. He still bore the marks of a life that had sometimes demanded ruthlessness. But now he chose better because he had seen the way a ledger could change lives. We did not announce our partnership with fanfare. We built our lives on shared labor. We planned a small clinic that would also double as a printing press on certain nights. We purchased a parcel of land on the edge of town, small but ours, where one day we could plant a garden and host a small school. These were acts of practical love. We built fences together. We painted a lean-to. We set up a makeshift operating table in the clinic where I taught the next generation of women how to staunch blood. Jonah's redemption was not a story of instant absolution. Men and women who'd been hurt by him had to reconcile with the new reality that he was part of the solution. He made amends where he could and accepted the consequences where he could not. The town did not forgive him in one breath. Forgiveness is a slow thing, like the healing of a surgical scar. But people began to see him as a man who had chosen a difficult path to make things right. I became a public figure, not as a glory, but as responsibility. I continued to write, but not with the zeal of one who wanted to be the loudest voice. I wrote with aim. I lectured on the importance of community oversight and the need to keep power accountable. Women found in me a model, not a perfect heroine, but a woman who had been wronged and had chosen to transform that wrong into collective power. The ledger itself returned to the community, copies lodged in the clerk's office, in the hands of auditors, in the memory of a town that had learned to keep its own watch. It had been a dangerous object. Its power was in its truth. Now it would remain a record and a warning. Our victory did not make the world safe. It only made it more honest. Justice, when it arrives, is rarely total, but it is real enough to change lives. In the wake of it, I found love that was not a prize, but a partnership. Jonah and I walked the new roads, not as a man and a woman bound by old scripts, but as two people who had shared danger and who chose each other freely. We had earned a life that was ours to shape, and that was the truest triumph. Years are generous when they are well used. 5 summers after the ledger's exposure, the wash house had become a proper clinic and a small press. The building's stone had been reinforced, its roof replaced, and a new sign painted in careful script, Ellis and Black Community Clinic and Gazette. It was both a practical enterprise and a symbolic one. The clinic tended to minors' injuries and births. The Gazette kept watch on the town's affairs with the tenacity of a person who remembers what silence can cost. I had intended once to be a woman defined by roles others prescribed. I had instead become someone who chose them in full knowledge. I had a small office with a desk after which Thomas's musty ledger had once been hidden in the washhouse loft. On that desk lay a drawer filled with copies of the ledger's pages, not as trophies, but as reminders. My hair, now streaked with silver at the temples, was gathered in a functional knot. My hands had more scars, a thin, pale line on the index finger from a splinted hand and a patch of callus near the thumb from years of holding pens and scalpels and planning. Our land, a modest plot that Jonah had reluctantly found charming, had a herd of chickens and a little garden with rows of carrots and kale and a patch of lavender for the women's sachets. Jonah had become a steady man about annoyances. He woke early to tend the animals and to take care of deliveries for the Gazette. He had a way of reading the newspaper now that made him chuckle like a man surprised at how much a pen could do. He retained his outlaw's skepticism, but he paired it with a patience I had not thought him capable of. The women who had once gathered in the wash house now ran the cooperative, making boots and dresses and books. They taught classes in bookkeeping and first aid and legal literacy. A small cohort of young women came to me and Jonah for mentorship. They learned the arts of repair and audacity, of welding a plowshare and editing an article. I taught them to be precise with both scalpel and sentence. Jonah taught them how to spot a liar's gait and how to move without notice. We were shaping a new generation of citizens who would not tolerate the quiet purchase of death. My newspaper column, once the only small voice, had become a weekly hub for critique and compassion. I wrote about things that mattered: a better water system, fair wages, the need for a local school that taught not only reading and arithmetic, but the skills of civic courage. I used the Gazette to bring women's accounts to the fore, and I used it to publish both rigorous instruction and tender stories of human endurance. I rarely wrote about my own heart openly. Grace had taught me the power of letting such matters be quiet and true. But when I did, the town read with an intimacy that sustained my work. Jonah and I had a life that was not perfect. We had arguments about money, about the degree of openness to give certain dangerous witnesses, about whether to take a leg of lamb or a loaf of bread in trade. We had moments of stubborn silence that ended with one of us making coffee and sitting down at a table to rebuild the day. But most of our life was a slow accrual of small kindnesses. He would always fetch the paper when the wind came hard. I would always mend his shirts even when the tears were his own to claim. We were companions because we chose each other every day. Our romance matured into something deliberate. We were lovers and colleagues and friends. We did not expect each other to be flawless. We expected instead to be accountable. Jonah never tried to save me. He saved alongside me when it mattered, and allowed me to save alongside him. He had been an outlaw. He was now a man entrusted with the town's trust. People still sometimes narrowed their eyes. Reputations take years to reweave, but more often now they nodded like people who had seen the ledger's light and who knew the price truth can demand. The clinic had become a place where women could train and work and earn independence. I cut payroll checks for women who had once been folding laundry in the courthouse's back rooms. We offered loans from a small fund to women who wanted to start a co-op. The legal reforms we had inspired were still being tested, but they were real. Protections for whistleblowers, clearer lines of auditing, and an emphasis on safety audits at the mine. The town had become a safer place because of the ledger's exposure, because of the women's courage, because of the law's teeth being finally applied. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, Jonah and I would sit on the porch and watch the valley breathe blue into purple. He would sometimes slip his hand into mine and press. He never claimed me as a trophy. He never asked me to be less. He listened as my hair went thin and as my back creaked in the cold. He learned to read my silences and to respect them. In return, I asked him to be kinder to himself and to accept that a past does not forever define a person who chooses otherwise. We had created a legacy not of revenge, but of repair. Women who had once been silenced were now teaching classes. Children who had once been afraid of the mind's rumble learned the names of women who had saved their fathers. Our town had changed, not overnight, but in a way that would outlast both of us. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are. When I think of Thomas now, I do not only remember loss. I remember the ledger he started and the life I refused to surrender. I remember the woman who learned to stitch both wounds and words. I remember the many hands that joined mine in danger and in repair. I remember Jonah, an outlaw who taught me to laugh with my whole mouth. And I remember that love, like justice, is built by people who do hard things together. If you look out across your own valley tonight, remember this. You do not have to be saved to be worthy of love. You can be the person who carves the